Welcome back to the Northern Sentinels podcast. I'm your host, Chris Ayotte. On this episode, I welcome Dick Fadden to the show. Born and raised in the eastern townships of Quebec, Dick suffered from itchy feet and wanted to find a way to contribute from an early age. He started his career with the Foreign Service and had the opportunity to serve in West Africa for a couple of years. When he returned to Ottawa, he served in many of the departments with national security responsibilities: the Food Inspection Agency, Citizenship and Immigration, Defense, and CSIS. Eventually, he became the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister. Since his retirement from government, he continues to find ways to serve through his engagement on national security issues and education of the public through various engagements. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Dick Fadden. Dick, welcome to the Northern Sentinels podcast. Thanks for being on the show.
Good to be with you.
As we were teeing this up and trading emails, you've been traveling a lot lately. So how do you decide what you're going to do with your time these days, and maybe what have you been doing in the last sort of 30 to 60 days?
Well, I've tried to stick to the resolution I made when I retired a little less than a decade ago, which was to spend a third of my time sort of traveling with my family, a third of my time doing consulting work or things like that, and a third of my time doing volunteer work. So a lot of the travel, and I don't do as much as I used to, is in support of a resolution I made when I was still working to the effect that I wanted to try and get defense, foreign policy, and national security more in people's minds in Canada, because I was convinced when I was still working that it was an important set of topics and one set that would become even more important. So I ramble on about these things. So I was recently in Taiwan, which is part of one of the areas that I've pushed a little bit. I think Taiwan's position in the world is one that we could support a little bit more than we have, we being Canada, although we have been supportive in a general way. So essentially, when I'm traveling in Canada, I get an opportunity to speak at conferences. For example, I'm going to the Vancouver Security Conference in November. I talk to them. I'm going to HISIF in Halifax at the end of November as well. And I try not to travel quite as much as I used to. One of the commitments I made to my family.
Well, and I mean, the travel part it's the time itself, but then it's just the toll it puts on you too. So you're not necessarily have as much energy to devote to the next family trip or all those other things. So I like the apportionment of that. I think that dividing your time in a way like that makes it a little bit easier to be disciplined. Was that something that you, during transition, were very mindful about, or do you see other people not transition out of service well and said, okay, I really need to figure out how to break this up or else it's going to take over my life?
I think the first conclusion I came to, and it took a little while, but I'd been working for the federal government for a couple of months short of 40 years. And I decided that, that was enough. I did not want to work for another large organization again. I enjoyed it. I like to think I made a contribution, but enough was enough. So having decided that, I had to decide whether or not I wanted another full-time job. And in bits and pieces, I came to the conclusion that, again, 40 years was enough. And then I had to decide what I was going to do, because I have some friends who spend most of their time on the golf course. I have other friends who sort of decide they're going to read and do nothing else. I have other friends who became fixated with, consulting and making as much money as they could. And I didn't want to do any of those things. So my objective was to try and find a division of time that would work for both my family and for me. I did want to give back a little bit to the volunteer sector, so I wanted to apportion a bit of time on that. And I did want to continue doing a little bit of consulting and whatnot. And mostly I've served on boards. And as part of the giving back, I include talking about foreign defense and security policy. I was all keen on traveling a lot more, but COVID sort of slowed us down a lot. Yeah. And we're just getting back into that now.
Let's talk a bit about the road of what got you here. I do find that the origin story of people is is quite illuminating to their path forward. So, where were you born? Where did you grow up?
I grew up in the eastern townships of Quebec, a little town about halfway between Montreal and Sherbrooke. It was an interesting part of the world when I was young. I always say it's a great part of the world to grow up in, probably a great part of the world to retire to. I'm not sure there's a lot going on for a lot of people for the middle period. In any event, I had a youth of no particular interest. I chugged along, went through high school, went to McGill to get a degree in political science. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, so I went to law school. And at the time, I thought I would practice law in Montreal. So the logic was, having been on one side of the mountain at McGill, I went to the other side of the mountain to the Université de Montréal.
Right.
When I was there, I decided, like a lot of people, that I had itchy feet. So I wrote the Foreign Service exams and got into the Foreign Service. Spent 6 or 7 years in the Foreign Service, and then slowly but surely, not slowly but surely, I was given an opportunity to work in the Privy Council office in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat, which I never really focused on. It seemed like an interesting area, and the clerk of the day wanted changes in that area. So I thought that might be interested. So that was my first real connection with security intelligence, national security.
So political science, a lawyer. Was there any of that in your family background? What sort of tilted you in that direction?
No, nothing at all. I was the first person in my family went to university, in fact, but I'd always been interested in law. I don't know why. I just am. I think it's one of the, not laws in particular, because the wonderful people that we elect to Parliament and the legislatures, I think occasionally donate to us laws that don't make a great deal of sense. But the law, the rule of law as a structure to provide for the organization of society, it's always interested me. And as you probably know, a lot of people who don't know what they want to do go into law because it offers a wide range of possibilities from, going into business to actually practicing law, government, international organizations. So I thought as I worked my way through law school, I'd figure out a little bit more what I wanted to do. And I became interested a bit in international law, and that led me to the Foreign Service.
You're the first to go to university. What were historically the family Fadden do?
The Faddens, through the decades, I guess, the way I put it, were largely farmers. My father's family was a United Empire loyalist, lived in the townships basically since the American Revolution. So farmers, I had no interest, none, zip, nada, in agriculture. And the only time that I was sort of compelled to develop an interest in agriculture is when I was appointed head of the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. And then all of a sudden, it was important to me. I mean, I've always known it's important. Feeding people is not unimportant. But I had a couple of really exciting is not the right word, but challenging experiences at CFIA, largely involving Alberta and BC, and that sort of was my connection with the land.
And how about your mother's side of the family? What were they also in agriculture?
In a general sort of way, when you're in the country, you do a little bit of everything. But her family has been there since the Ancien Régime. They came over a long, long time ago, wow. Largely farming in one shape, form, or other.
Now, what did your parents think, or even friends, about when you indicated that you wanted to go to university? Was something that was embraced, or was breaking from sort of family tradition or business?
No, not really. I think I was always, moderately good at school. So I think that sort of prepared them for the shock of my saying I wanted to go to university. So were people supportive? Yes. A lot of my classmates, though, did not go on. I mean, when you're living in a rural community, there's the basic decision, are you going to stay in that area or are you going to do something else? So most of my friends, I think it's fair to say, stayed. And, they sort of looked at me, I suppose, like is the case with many other people who leave their locality, as a bit of an oddball. And I guess it's true to say over the years I've lost touch. I mean, I don't have much to do with that area anywhere. It's 50, 60 years now. It's a long time. So I think people honestly were broadly supportive, if somewhat surprised.
And what did you Other than the usual things that the kids do before they go to university, spending their time doing chores, spending their time doing homework. I mean, did you have any particular hobbies or interests growing up that you either carried forward, or maybe they were abandoned when you left and went to
No,
McGill?
I don't think so. I was just a generalist, I guess would be an honest way of putting it. I mean, I had the occasional odd job, like everybody else. And nothing in particular. One of my characteristics, though, is I am not an athlete. I don't particularly like sports, and I've never played them more than when I had to. So that I've carried through to the current day. My wife, who comes from a family of 4 boys and a father who were terribly athletic, says that she married me because I couldn't tell the difference between a baseball and a hockey puck. And I've sort of maintained that. I mean, I acknowledge the need, the utility of sport, but it just ain't me.
I think that's always important too, is understanding who you are and who you are not. It's a really good thing. You mentioned you mentioned this previously too, and I'm glad you raised it today about itchy feet, about having itchy feet. Do you have a sense of why that was? Like, what exactly was it? The spirit of the age in which you sort of in the university at the time, or what exactly was compelling you to want to get out and see a bit of the world or do something?
That's a very good question. I mean, despite the fact I think that describes how I felt, I've never really thought about why. I think part of it was my university studies. I did a bit of international relations. The mood of the age, was to go out a little bit. I thought that, fundamentally, I think I'm an organization man in the sense that, I never really thought I'd go off and be an entrepreneur on my own. So I sort of tried to figure out how, at the time, I could organize myself to go abroad within an organization, and the Foreign Service came to mind. Today, there are many, many more opportunities. You can go work for a bank, you can go work for international organizations much more easily than you could then. So I just thought it would be interesting to give it a try. Did I expect to stay in the Foreign Service forever? I did not, but I thought I'd stay longer than I did. But I had an opportunity to do something else and decided to do that.
What's the first thing you did in the Foreign Service once you got into foreign affairs?
I had decided by then I didn't want to practice law. So, of course, they assigned me to the legal bureau. Inevitably.
Sounds about right.
Yeah, that's right. It's like, if you're a really good expert in China, they'll send you to Indonesia. But it was an interesting first year. It's sort of your training year, and I was assigned to the legal bureau, and I did private international law, which involved mostly supporting my boss in dealing with what are called civil kidnappings, sort of when one parent takes a child away.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
That was very interesting, if not particularly uplifting, because there's relatively little that governments can do when that happens, except, try and press the governments of the country to which the children have been taken. But in a manner of speaking, it's a form of consular work. You're trying to help Canadians to get themselves out of a situation that they don't want to be in. I found it quite difficult after a while because occasionally somebody would come in and they're almost crying in my office because their child or their children had been taken by the other parent. So that was the first thing I did in the year. Then after that, the tradition then in foreign affairs was you spent about a year in Ottawa, a little bit more, a little bit less, then you got an assignment internationally. So like everybody else, I asked for New York, London, or Paris, so I was assigned to West Africa, which at the time was actually difficult. I was bilingual, so they sent me to Ghana, but Ghana was responsible for 2 francophone countries, Togo and Benin. So I was given particular responsibility for Benin because I could speak French. So I spent 2 years minus a day or 2 in West Africa. At the time, I found it quite difficult. Ghana was going through a tough time. And because I was constantly moving between Benin and between Benin and Ghana, I found it very difficult to settle. If you're in one place, you eventually make friends and you settle down. I'd just get back to Ghana, get my laundry done, get myself organized, and I'd have to leave again. So for that reason, I didn't, I think, enjoy it as much as I could. Truth be known, I probably drank slightly more gin than I should have, like a lot of people did back in those days. In retrospect, it was a wonderful opportunity. I mean, I got to understand a little bit about the developing world. I think the Ghanaians are some of the nicest people on the planet. Because I was responsible largely for a small country all on my own, I got to do political work, economic work, trade work, immigration work. And I got a view of, relationships between two countries that I never would have got. If I got New York, I would have been given a very narrow little boxed-in thing to do. Would undoubtedly have been interesting. But in retrospect, I thought it gave me a range of what foreign affairs does abroad. It gave me an understanding of the developing world. And just generally to be on my own in a way that would have been harder, I think, in New York or London or Paris or somewhere like that.
Did you have any other opportunities in your career to do that sort of work abroad?
Not really. I had any number of opportunities because of jobs I held to be interested in what Canada was doing abroad. When I worked for the Auditor General for a while, and in my audit portfolio were a number of organizations that did work abroad, so I got to travel in that context. I traveled a fair bit when I was at CSIS in national defense, but in that kind of work, not really.
Did you have any desire to do that, or was that first exposure sort of enough to say, okay, this was good, but I think my future lies elsewhere?
I think at the time I would have said my future lies elsewhere. I enjoyed what I was doing. I went back to foreign affairs, or external affairs as it was then called. And once again, I was assigned to the legal bureau, spent a little bit of time there. And in part, I think because I was bilingual, I was seconded to the deputy minister's office, eventually became the deputy minister's EA, a chap named Gordon Oswald Deston, who became clerk of the Privy Council. He was, while I was there, made clerk, and at one point asked if I'd be interested in working in PCO. And that's how I ended up at PCO.
So maybe you can describe for the listener exactly what the function of PCO is.
There's a big debate going on about that right now, as you probably know. I think it has a couple of missions in life. One is to support the Prime Minister. There's a whole sector there that is oriented towards being the department of the Prime Minister, and the clerk, that's one of his jobs. The other part is to support cabinet, and that's a broad coordinating job. And I think those are the two big responsibilities of PCO. National security is a little bit different because it's slightly more operational than some other parts of PCO, because there's no other I think truly a government-wide entity that can coordinate national security, foreign and defense policy. But a lot of it is to support the Prime Minister. I used to give a briefing when I was in various departments. Since I'd been in PCO, people asked me, well, the same question you've just asked. And I used to do up a slide, and I saying, the role of the PCO to protect the Prime Minister, protect the Prime Minister, protect the Prime Minister. And I think it can be reduced to that. As the head of government, his success or her success and failure is fundamental to the effective operation of the government. So PCO, I'd like to think, while operating within the law and, the parameters of not being partisan, we did a lot of stuff trying to protect the Prime Minister. That involved knowing what was going on, which is very important, trying to coordinate and periodically telling people, this is not a good idea. So in a general sort of way, PCO is a vast coordinating agency at the bureaucratic level in support of the PMO and the Prime Minister so that they know what's going on. One of the things I've learned in my career is politicians really don't like surprises. They don't even like pleasant surprises. They'd rather be warned. I know this sounds a strange thing, but I've been told on a number of occasions, it's just not the bad news. Just if you're in politics, better not to be surprised. So part of what PCO does is to try and have its pulse on what's going on the vast array of departments and agencies around town.
Was that role of the Privy Council office the same when you first joined as when you departed as the National Security Advisor?
That's a good question, and I think it's tough to answer in some ways because I think PCO is very much a function of the Prime Minister of the day. Are there small institutional changes? during some periods, they may take on a couple of extra secretariat because people are very interested in this area. There was a time when there was a standalone secretariat on relations with First Nations. There was another one dealing with the United States. But that's really a reflection of what the Prime Minister wants done. So, for example, all Prime Ministers, I think, go in with aside from their party platform and what's going on, they have a broad interest in some areas of government. Mr. Trudeau, I think it's fair to say, is very interested in social policy. Doesn't mean he doesn't do other things, but he certainly does a lot of social policy. Mr. Harper, I think, was more interested in the economic side. Mr. Chrétien, I think, was, more interested in how government operated and a bit on the social side, but was driven to Afghanistan and having to deal with, the American request to go or not go to Iraq. These things have a big impact on PCO. They adjust depending upon what the Prime Minister of the day wants. And if the Prime Minister is particularly interested in an area and wants to know more what's going on, PCO reinforces. All the while trying as hard as we can, not to be partisan, because if you work there long enough, it's very hard not to take on the Prime Minister's sort of broad interest and whatnot, particularly if the Prime Minister is an easygoing, relatively pleasant fellow. My favorite Prime Minister, which I probably shouldn't say, is Mr. Chrétien, because I fought the wars with him. That's when I was there with 9/11. Doesn't mean I didn't like Mr. Harper or Mr. Trudeau, but when you go through the wars, as they say, with somebody, it sort of changes things. I also think over time, PMO and implicitly PCO has become somewhat more partisan, just because of the nature of politics and how it's evolved in Canada. And certainly we've become more preoccupied than we should be, I think, with, next day, next week, next month. One of the things we used to say in government was, while we dealt with the next day, the next week, the public service was the custodian of longer-term problems for oncoming governments. And I think they still do that, but I think they do it less than they used to because, the 24/7 news cycle, instantaneous communication around the world drives everybody to worry about what's going to happen next hour, next day, next month.
When you showed up at PCO, was that your first touch with national security and intelligence as a core responsibility?
Yeah, it was. I mean, you got a little bit of it in foreign affairs, but, it was really tangential. And I was initially appointed what's called a Privy Council officer, and I eventually became the Director of Policy in the Security and Intelligence Secretariat. And my job essentially was to try and give some thought for my superiors about how we could change things and how things were operating. I think it's fair to say that back then, not a great deal of attention was being given to security and intelligence. We sort of chugged along. I know, because I was told on a number of occasions, as was my boss, that the Americans were not happy. They thought we should do more, and we really weren't doing a great deal. And we'd sort of become, I think, to some degree entrenched in sort of a post-World War II/Cold War approach to life. And I don't think we were changing with the time. So my job at a very junior level was to sort of look at all of this, do some papers and, develop some options with my colleagues and my bosses about how the structure might be shifted a little bit to make us a little bit more able to deal with the world as it was evolving.
If that was your first touch with national security, what was your initial impressions? Was it something you were drawn to, or at that point was it very much just another file or another thing to be exposed to in the town?
I think a bit of both, to be honest. I think it was particularly interested because I was being asked to be part of a team that was looking at how things could change. And, in government, you don't get these opportunities all that often. You're usually asked to, manage something, to do something. But at the time when I first went there, I regarded it as an opportunity to, become familiar with a particular sector of activity. I stayed there 7 or 8 years, which in PCO is a long time. In part was because I liked it, in part because at that time the public service was fairly stable and there wasn't a lot of movement. But after 7 or 8 years, I'd done my shtick. I'd been promoted once. I enjoyed very much what I was doing, but I thought it was time for a change.
You moved around a fair bit in different organizations, which you already mentioned the Auditor General, National Resources, Treasury Board. Mm-hmm. You talked about the Food Inspection Agency, Citizenship and Immigration, of course, the Service, Department of National Defense. I'm wondering if the moving through different departments, what your thoughts on, is that a good approach in terms of development of the public service? Or is there a benefit to being in one domain or maybe one or two domains that have an overlap in terms of the professionalization, the deepening of the knowledge of our public service?
Yes, to both.
Okay.
Let me divide my answer into two parts. When I was a deputy and before I became a deputy, by the time you're an EX, sort of, colonelish and captainish, unless you're really fixated on an area, you look at where there are opportunities, that might become available, ideally in where you are so that you can sort of reinforce what you're doing. So I used to joke when I was a deputy minister and I was being asked to either sit on selection boards or to approve the appointment of somebody. At the time, there was a long list of things that we were to take into account, Anglo, Franco, man, woman, whether the person had disabilities. I could go on. And I thought then, and I think now, these are all highly desirable objectives. But I also used to say, to some of my colleagues, it's also helpful if the person knows what he or she's doing. And I think there's a balance to be found. I think today, particularly if you're going to become senior or fairly senior, you got to know how the system works. And if you stay only in one department, that's very hard to do. One of the discussions I had a lot with, my military colleagues when I was at D&D was that as useful as it may be for military staff to know their jobs to perfection by staying only within the Canadian Forces, by the time they became senior and wanted to get something done in town, they didn't understand the town, and much, I think, to the detriment of the Canadian Forces. So I think there's a balance to be found between, if you've got a PhD in something, you're going to stay in a particular area and become an expert. But if you're, a generalist, a bit like I was, bouncing around a little bit, I think is helpful. But if you aspire to be a deputy, you got to understand how the system works, and it is so complicated today that I think it's helpful to have bounced around a little bit. Now, when you're a deputy, it's a bit like when you're a Jesuit. You go where you're told. I mean, my first deputy level appointment was as deputy clerk during 9/11. Then I was sent to CFIA, then natural resources, then immigration, then so on and so forth. And I didn't have a great deal of say in this. As you become much more senior as a deputy, you can sort of negotiate a bit with the clerk. But initially, you just go where you're told. I know there's been a debate for a long time in the public service about whether it's helpful to have deputy ministers know their departments. And I think there's a balance to be had. And I think you get that by having them stay in place slightly longer. But having somebody from who joined as a PM1 and became a DM3 only in one department, that person cannot advise, in my opinion, his or her minister effectively on how to get things done. Because you have to understand PCO, the Treasury Board, the Department of Finance, and a whole raft of other departments in town. So some movement is I think, absolutely necessary. It's finding the right balance. And for some people it works, some people it doesn't work. In my particular case, I don't know if there was a directing brain, in PCO. But I ended up getting a fair bit of foreign affairs, defense, national security opportunities by the time I became CSIS director, defense deputy, and the NSA. One of the challenges in our public service is that we're not huge. There aren't 1,000 people available, for every senior job. So the clerk and his colleagues, have to juggle getting people around. and hope that they're either bright enough or they're going to stay long enough that they can do a really effective job. In many of mine, I was lucky because I'd had a bit of experience in those areas before I was asked to get into them. On the other hand, when I was sent to natural resources, I knew nothing about natural resources, and I found that both a positive and a negative challenge, because you got to get up to snuff fairly quickly. Natural resources handles electricity, things nuclear, forests. It's a pretty broad department. In those kinds of circumstances, I think the system expects you to help the department manage itself within the broader public service and with the private sector, those parts of the private sector that you're dealing with. And if you stay long enough, and I didn't stay long enough because there were a couple of moves elsewhere that compelled the system to move me, if you stay long enough, then you can actually add value on substance more than you might if you're just coming in as a generalist.
You mentioned that you were in the Privy Council office during 9/11. Curious as to how that event shifted from the sort of day before to the day after 9/11 in the way things operated, the view of the world, especially considering where you were situated in PCO.
Well, let me tell you, just in terms of a small anecdote, how I found out about 9/11. I was sitting in my office, and I always had television on a news station, and I was signing papers. And I looked up at one point, and I saw the first plane go into the tower in New York. And in the back of my mind, I said, I wonder how this got shifted to a movie. And I just kept on going until maybe 3 minutes later, somebody came in and said, do you realize what's happened? And I think it's fair to say that almost instantaneously, everybody in the sector that I was working in shifted from a fairly dedicated but relatively easygoing collection of people to being entirely preoccupied with trying to come to grips with 9/11. I mean, we had to make sure the clerk knew, that the prime minister knew. Initially, I think we forget collectively how little we knew the first few days and the first few weeks. I mean, there was a real expectation on the part of everybody on this planet that there would be another attack. We really didn't know. So initially, it was a matter of bringing together deputies from all sorts of departments from around town, making sure that they were aware of what happened, ratcheting up surveillance, asking CBSA to pay more attention about who was coming in the building, airport security being ratcheted up, asking the RCMP to make sure that they were doing their shtick, basically asking everybody initially to just pay more attention to what was going on. The big change initially, I think, Mr. Chrétien, I think I said, was not a prime minister who was principally motivated by national security issues. He paid attention to them, but he had other preoccupations. 9/11 changed that. I mean, he created a special committee to deal with 9/11. He appointed the Deputy Prime Minister, John Manley, as the lead minister on this. He became involved in dealing with the Americans and whatnot. So that mood changed everything. And I think in dealing with 9/11, we had three ways of looking at it. One was, what did this do to the world? Where did this come from? What is it going to mean for the future? Two was, what is it going to mean for Canada's security? What are we going to have to do that we haven't been doing or that we haven't been worrying about that we should worry about? And three, what is it going to do with our relationships with the United States, who were the principal targets? And we spent a lot of time on all three, alternating, which one was the most important for the day. But for us, initially reassuring the United States that the attackers did not come from Canada was really important. Then the Americans, I think understandably, became really quite preoccupied about the effectiveness of their border control. So we spent a lot of time discussing with them the who, how, what, when, where, and how the border was going to be controlled. Something that we didn't spend a lot of time on before, Going back to, you asked me a question about my youth. I can remember I was born about 10 miles from the Vermont border, and we used to go across to go to the movies or something, and, I used to use my high school library card.
Yeah.
I mean, this hasn't happened for a long time. So a lot of it was managing these three subsets of what 9/11, I think, meant for meant for Canada, for me. But fundamentally, it meant that I didn't get a lot of time off until around Christmas, when my boss of the day, Mel Cap, basically said I needed to take some time off. But it was true of everybody. I mean, it was all hands, to stations. And as things progressed, slowly but surely, we became relatively certain there wasn't going to be another major attack anyway. So then we turned to what are we going to do from a policy perspective? I was involved, were a number of my colleagues, in pulling together a budget that the government eventually submitted to Parliament. I think Parliament appropriated over $7 billion before Christmas to deal with national security over a few years. We then spent a lot of time, I think in the first quarter of the next year, fundamentally changing national security law, 99% of which was sustained by the Supreme Court over time, although there was controversy attached to some parts of it. So we went from, oh my God, what are we going to do tomorrow to make sure Canada's safe? What are we going to do to help our American friends and worry about the world, to what policy and resource decisions can be taken in the medium term to put Canada in a better position to deal with all of this. And then slowly but surely, I wouldn't say that things came back to normal. There was never the same normal again. But, you settle down into coordinating, making sure the departments and agencies, could talk to one another, were talking to one another, that the resources were spent as effectively as possible, ongoing talks with our American colleagues, and then with the Brit and our Australian and other colleagues around the world to try and make sense of it all.
So that's a really good overview of the impact on government. What sort of impact did it have on you personally? And was it an event that set the conditions for your continued focus on national security issues in your future?
Well, I think the first effect was I don't think I've ever worked that hard in my life, for the first 3 or 4 months. And a lot of jobs in the federal government are some distance from, individual Canadians. Municipalities and provinces, I think, to be honest, are a little closer. So you can sort of sit, I don't mean to exaggerate this, but with a little bit of detachment. You're working on high-level policies or whatever, in whatever department you're in. This drove home to me that the things that my colleagues and I were working on in support of ministers, affected human beings. Somebody might die, somebody might get hurt. And it fundamentally changed the overall focus of the security and intelligence, the national security community, from the Cold War, which was already revving down because of the fall of the Soviet Union, to terrorism. So we spent a lot of time in all departments and agencies in trying to get people to, sort of like the Queen Mary. You don't shift all these people overnight. But, to get people to start in CSE and CSIS and the RCMP and GAC and elsewhere to start thinking about terrorism as the principal concern as opposed to the Cold War, which did remain important to deal with. And in fact, I think over time, we came to the conclusion that we neglected the Cold War a little bit too much.
One of the jobs you did after PCO, you were at Citizenship and Immigration. And I bring this up because I think you were there when we did a non-combatant evacuation of Canadians out of Lebanon in 2006. Mm-hmm. And it'd be great to hear your experiences in that, mainly because we're in a very similar situation today with Canadians in Lebanon.
So I think the main thing to remember in the context of bringing people home from Lebanon, it was a foreign affairs lead, and all of the other departments in town were in support. Citizenship and Immigration's main role was, to make sure that the people who were coming into the country, coming back to the country, should be included on the list of people being brought back. But more broadly, one of the things I find that people forget is that you cannot take a 5,000 or 20,000 person organization and expect them to intuitively to know exactly what to do in a whole of government kind of operation. And in something that large, a large chunk of the government had to coordinate what was happening. GAC, defense, immigration, you needed resources, there were other departments involved. So a lot of the work was to make sure that people in each of the organizations were talking to their opposite numbers across government and that they were all pursuing the objective in a coherent fashion. All departments doing it differently. You're a former military man, so you'll know that the Canadian Forces approach is to have a 600-page operational order. I exaggerate to make my point. But
it's a security blanket for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, other departments do it differently. And, but the bottom line is you have to have everybody through the chain of command and people who are actually working at the coalface understand that you're asking them to shift to do something differently. You have to make sure as well that ministers are aware of how difficult or not difficult it is. It seems simple sometimes to people, we're going to evacuate people from Lebanon. Okay. You can bring in a whole bunch of C-17s from defense. You can rent a few ocean liners. You can do any number of things. But you're also operating in the territory of another sovereign state in a war zone or quasi-war zone. You have people some of whom are in great shape. You have children, you have infirm people, you have old people, people who are ill. All of this put into a stew means that even the simplest kind of evacuation, let alone something from Lebanon, is very, very complicated. And the most important thing that needs to be done, I think, other than the basic logistical things, is to make sure that people are coordinated and know what they're doing. Immigration at the time was trying to support the act to the extent that we could.
One of the interesting things about an evacuation of this nature is that some people will be critical of saying, well, this is October 7th, we just passed the anniversary, and as things have heated up in the Middle East, I'm saying about Canadians in the region, well, why would you stay there? And now this has become the government's problem, and I think it's a valid observation, but you're still a Canadian citizen. So how is that sort of viewed inside the town here, and or is it looked at with a bit of a critical eye like that, or is it very much you're Canadian, regardless of that, we will do whatever we can?
That's a good question. I think the initial position, the default position, is that a Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian. And in most cases, when Canadians get into trouble abroad, that's not a difficult call because you're dealing with a family or a small group of people. You start multiplying this by the thousands. It's not that you're less of a Canadian, but also many people in this country are aware that a lot of Lebanese Canadians basically live in Lebanon. Does it make them less of a Canadian? No. But you cannot help but ask the question, if they've lived there for the last 10 years, should the Canadian taxpayer become responsible for their being removed to Canada? Fundamentally, it's a government decision. Different governments take different stands. My own view, for what it may be worth, is that to the extent that you can do it, if you have a Canadian passport, you should be treated like a Canadian. Now, that doesn't mean that if the government, rents you or gets you a ticket on an aircraft out of Lebanon, that you shouldn't be compelled to pay for the price of the ticket. There's nobody says anywhere that it's a free deal. Again, a balancing act.
Now, I believe your next job after that was going to CSIS. Do I have that correct?
Immigration and CSIS.
Yeah. So how did that job come about? You clearly have some background on the intelligence side with PCO, and probably touched on various aspects in the other departments you are in. But how does one's hat get thrown into the ring to fill that position?
Well, first of all, I didn't have a hat to throw in. As I was saying earlier, if you're a deputy minister, you pretty well go where you're told to go.
Right.
There's a process where every year, people are asked what they're interested in, what they'd want to do. I really liked immigration. It was one of those departments that did economic, social, and security. It did FedProv, it did international, it did domestic, it did operations, it did policy. So I would have been happy to stay. I had 3 very good ministers, but I got a call saying CSIS is available. I think since 9/11, my file had an NS stamped on it, national security stamped on it. It would be pretty hard not to be. Assuming I didn't muck up too badly. So I think I was one of a number of candidates that, the clerk and others would have considered for the job. To be honest, I thought it was an interesting job offer. I thought I knew a little bit about national security and that it would fit. And in the end, I was happy to go.
For listeners who aren't familiar with CSIS, can you give us a sense of what exactly CSIS does in the broadest sense?
CSIS is an information collection agency. That's what it fundamentally does. It collects information on national security issues. Unlike The Economist or the Globe and Mail, it does both open source collection and collection that involves very intrusive approaches to information collection, including talking to people. Sometimes they know you're from CSIS and sometimes they don't. So fundamentally, they're to collect information, to assess it, and to make sure the government is aware of threats. Of late, a few years ago, CSIS has been given a threat reduction mandate, which means that if CSIS can identify a particular threat that can be reduced or a particular violation of the law that can be reduced, they have the authority to do this so they don't violate the charter and a couple of other conditions. They also do a fair bit of security clearance on that side of things. But more than anything, they are a collection agency. They're there to use all lawful means to try and figure out things about terrorism, nuclear proliferations, sedition, foreign interference, and they do this through a variety of means. The thing to remember is that notwithstanding the hundreds and hundreds of movies that people see, there are no James Bonds in CSIS. I can think of only 2 instances while I was director where I authorized people to carry arms. And, people joke, with me over the years that, oh my God, it must have been fantastic being like James Bond. My wife sort of said, no, he's Judi Dench. And there's some truth to that in the sense that I wasn't operational, I was the director. But the key for CSIS is to find every lawful mean they can to detect, report, and in some cases reduce threats to the national security of Canada.
You went in 2009, I believe.
I think that's right.
How was the environment at that time, considering you were in PCO at 9/11, so you were very much there as there was this sea change. But now we are 8 short years later. Is it a similar energy behind national security, or have things sort of started to swing back to, for lack of a better term, the natural state of national security in Canada?
I think it's fair to say that the intensity that we all saw right after 9/11 had begun to dissipate, which is not to say that people weren't still interested in terrorism, because it was the business of the organization. We did not, I think, in retrospect, spend quite as much time as we should have on espionage and things of that nature, because we were so preoccupied and resources were limited. But I think there had been a sea change in Ottawa. CSIS, CSE, the RCMP, and others have become preoccupied with terrorism. And you don't need me to remind you that Afghanistan happened, Iraq happened, ISIS happened, Syria. All of this, put into a stew meant that, yes, it wasn't quite as intense as after 9/11, but it was still pretty intense. And over the course of my time there, we became aware of and took steps to avoid a few terrorist attacks against Canada. We, in a couple of cases, or a few cases, were able to tell our allies that we found something suspicious going on in their neck of the woods and warn them. So, going back to what I said earlier, one of the nice things about CSIS sometimes is it had a real impact on the ground, as opposed to high-level policy.
Before you arrived at CSIS, did you have a good sense, or were you starting to see as you said about the espionage, the rise of the state and the need for us to be more focused on the state as opposed to terrorism, counterinsurgency, the things that had dominated the previous 8-9 years?
To be honest, no. I think I was aware that it was an issue. I mean, I don't mean to suggest that it was forgotten. It wasn't forgotten. It's just given a lower priority. So I think everybody was so focused on terrorism that lower priority was continued for a while, except a few brave souls, not just in CSIS but elsewhere, who kept pounding on the table saying, while you're worried about terrorism, there are a number of other countries that, are still pretty active. By the time, I used to say that by the time I became NSA, the general view, I think, was that the level of espionage directed against Canada then was at as high a level as it was during the height of the Cold War. So it didn't go away. And as Russia became more assertive in its attempts to sort of reinforce its position in the world, there was a lot of espionage going on, to say nothing of China.
Now, when you took over in CSIS in 2010, you raised the flag on foreign interference. And doing a little bit of reading before this, it seemed like, just from what I read in the media, but it seemed like, I'm not sure if that wasn't taken seriously or there was people who certainly kind of called you out as maybe being alarmist. Do I have that right from the public reporting? Is that the sense that you had from raising that concern?
I think so. I mean, one of the things that's coming out clearly today in, say, Justice Hoag's inquiry is that, the intelligence agencies have been telling the government about problems for a long time. The government was aware that foreign intelligence was an issue, but it wasn't a priority. I also was very careful, to the extent I could be, I think. I said that there were some circumstances where some individuals were under some level of influence on the foreign side. This got translated into, people were being accused of manipulating Parliament and manipulating. So it got exaggerated. I think another complicating factor is at the time there was a minority government in Ottawa, and the opposition seized upon this as a means of sort of causing trouble for the government, both in the sense some of them were saying it was exaggerated, some of them were saying they hadn't taken it seriously enough. So I think it made for a fairly difficult transition for an environment where it wasn't being given much attention, to be honest. That's part of the issue. Terrorism still got most of the attention. I think in the end, if you look at the evolution of the file on foreign interference, I wasn't exaggerating it at the time. I would have preferred that it not be that my I think relatively constrained comments would not have resulted in quite the excitement that they generated. But they did serve the purpose, I think, for beginning to get people to focus a little bit on what people in the intelligence community, I believe, thought was a serious issue.
What makes something on the national security side compelling to an elected official? That's something that I've struggled with over the years on the defense side, but you've sort of just talked about this foreign interference piece and raising it in 2010, and here we are, 15 years later, and still dealing with this. So what are the sort of elements that you think make politicians, make elected officials, or I don't know, maybe even senior bureaucrats, you would have a far better insight than I, compelled to action on these types of issues?
Well, let me try by starting with a couple of general comments. First of all, for ministers and prime ministers, but also some senior officials, they have a daily balancing act to where they're going to spend their attention. And it's not quite as easy as I think a lot of people make out. We in this country criticize ministers constantly, and some of them deserve the criticism, but they also don't have a particularly easy job. They're having to balance resources, time, effort on a vast array of issues. So they tend to shift, and I include senior officials in this, I think they tend to shift their attention to areas of immediacy, where, there's a likelihood that something will surface really quickly and will cause public attention to shift to the issue. Another area where I think it's probably fair to say most Canadian governments would agree with this. One of my political masters once basically said to me, we were trying to deal with an issue. It attracted parliamentary and media attention. It wasn't the end of the world, but it was irritating. And I went to him and said, if you'll allow somebody in the community to say A, B, C, I can make this go away. I mean, it's just the facts were wrong in this particular case. Nobody was at particular fault. And the answer was national security is to be dealt with, not talked about. So there was a real predisposition on the part of most people, I think, to deal with national security issues to the extent possible under the radar screen. So if you can't do that, I think what really attracted their attention was immediacy and the level of harm. I can remember talking to people about a couple of possible terrorist attack. You'll remember there was a lot of publicity about individuals in Toronto, trying to or thinking about blowing up the CN Tower. Well, that attracted attention. That's immediate. The harm would be very, very considerable. Telling them that we had a succession of intelligence reports in provinces A, B, and C about individuals of a particular ethnic background contemplating about doing a variety of things at some point in the future with some level of seriousness, it's very difficult to capture their attention. And I can understand why. You have to bring together a compelling case that, because also, we have the charter here and the rule of law. Just because CSIS thinks that there's a particular problem with bloggins, who, is musing about doing something, doesn't mean that there are grounds for taking action. You have to be really careful. And there are a lot of people, if you look at, pick terrorism as an example, you can start at one end with people sort of, generally unhappy with government, they're having a beer or a coffee, all the way to people who are making bombs in their basement with the real intention of exploding them. And there's a huge range of possible activities in the middle. And I think most governments would expect that on this side of the spectrum, the just thinking about things to talking to people about it, to this, that, or the other thing, that the public service, CSIS and others will deal with it. It's only when you reach sort of the middle towards people who are not just radicalized, but radicalized to violence. It's the violence, I think, that attracts attention. I mean, it's been a while since I've retired, but my sense is that people in government today, both political and officials, are more sensitive now to something that, started here on the spectrum, on the left-hand side, can move very quickly towards violence. And one of the things that I used to argue when I was working was that there was too great a tendency to worry about dealing with the effects of radicalization to violence and not enough attention being dedicated to trying to deal with it, the underlying causes. And I think we're very poor at this. We're better at whack-a-mole. You may have heard today or yesterday, I think the head of MI5 or MI6 in the United Kingdom said that ISIS is remaining and becoming a major, major issue, terrorist issue in the world. Why is that? We haven't dealt with the underlying problems. Now, I don't know how to do that. I'm not Talleyrand or Henry Kissinger, but clearly what we have been doing in large part in the West generally is play whack-a-mole. We found out that we find there's a problem and we hit them either at the individual level or we go into Iraq for the United States or Afghanistan. But, all of these people at my light end of the spectrum, I think, can be dealt with more effectively than you can by having CSIS or the RCMP pop up at their door and arrest them, for violating the criminal code and the anti-terrorism provisions. I used to argue as well, along with a number of my colleagues, there's no such thing as national security anymore. It has a subnational component and an international component. And I think in Canada, we've underplayed the potential useful role that civil society and the provinces could play in dealing with terrorism at this very, very early stage, largely because we don't want to talk about it. We don't talk about national security, defense, and foreign affairs in this country. Witness the last two federal elections. I don't think any of those words have been issued more than once or twice. So if you're not interested in it intrinsically, like, say, the Americans or the Brits are, and they have more cause to be than we do, it's very hard for the federal government to say to the provinces collectively, look, you have access to kids in colleges and in high schools and in community centers. Can we come together and try and talk about how we can talk to them? before they become radicalized and radicalized to violence. So I think if you extend that, I'm going beyond your question, I'm sorry, but if you extend that to the international level, the United States and the Allied intervention in Syria certainly played whack-a-mole quite effectively with ISIS. It removed their territorial control. It did a variety of things, but there are ISISes in 5 or 6 other countries, if not more. We have, remnants of Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We have the Houthis. We have a number of groups in Somalia and elsewhere. And just because we don't hear about them doesn't mean they're not potentially a problem. And we will continue, I think, because it's all that we can do right now is play whack-a-mole. And in particular, when we're worried about China and Russia, it's very hard to develop sort of a NATO-wide or a Five Eyes-wide policy to try and deal with the underlying causes of why people are so unhappy that they're prepared to blow themselves up or to blow up other people.
Do you get a sense that it's not just a national security issue, but we seem to take this approach in Canada on a number of issues. So, you could use the pandemic as one where we were talking about all these grand plans to really be far more resilient in the future to pandemics. I'm not sure how many of those plans have actually materialized or in flight. Do you think this is just part of the Canadian culture of feeling safe and secure here in North America? Or is this something perhaps that is unique to national security?
That's a good question. One of my colleagues, another deputy minister, was basically fundamentally involved in the SARS epidemic way back when. And after that, there were a whole bunch of reviews done. And he tells me that these reviews were done and not a great deal of attention was given to implementing any of their recommendation. And then we're now into COVID. So I think it's not just national security, it's public health and other areas. But, I think I don't think Canadians realize how lucky we are. We really don't have a great deal to worry about. I mean, God knows the country is not perfect and we have, there are issues, real issues with homelessness and dealing with various communities. But compared to the rest of the planet, we have 3 oceans in the United States. We don't feel threatened in a very basic way. That being the case, I don't think we spend enough time in what I call mitigation, in trying to deal with preventing things in the future. I think that's true in terms of dealing with disruptive events, emergency planning, on the pandemic side, on the natural resources side. Just to make clear that I'm not dissing everybody else and excluding myself, when I was government, I should have tried to do more on this than I did. But it's somehow... we deal with the crisis, and I think when there's a real crisis, we're pretty effective at dealing with it. What we did after 9/11, the government of Canada did one heck of a lot very, very quickly. I think it dealt with COVID quite well. So in the middle of the crises, we seem to be able to, if I'm dating myself, pop the clutch and get things done. Yeah. But absent a real, the immediate crisis, I think we don't tend to spend enough time, money, and effort everything with dealing with potential flooding because of climate change or, the spread of pandemics, disruptive events generally. One of the reasons I like to talk about, national security a little bit more is because I think it's in everybody's interest to think about these things a little bit before the crisis occurs. But no, I don't think it's restricted to national security. And I think it's because we are fundamentally very comfortable as a people. And we let things go that sometimes perhaps we'd be better advised to push a little bit more than we have.
You've already mentioned that you really don't have a lot of choice when you go to a new job, when you move out of a job, and you left CSIS after 4 years? Just about, a little less. And you came over to the Department of National Defense to be the deputy minister. So I'm just curious as to how leaving CSIS and entering D&D at that time was, because you were still entering an organization that, for lack of a better term, on a war footing, dealing with Afghanistan. And was that Was that I won't say easy, but was that a fairly natural transition moving out of security intelligence into defense? What did the organization, the look and feel when you arrived as a deputy minister?
At one level, it was relatively effortless because I served on a lot of committees that involved national defense, national security, foreign affairs, and you're sort of aware of the meta issues. On the other hand, D&D is much, much, much larger than CSIS, and that presents its whole range of issues. D&D, for one reason or the other, had managed to, I think, frustrate the central agencies considerably at the time I was sent over. There was no capital plan. The financial plan wasn't in really great shape. A few retired general officers were commenting very negatively on what was going on. And the government was, I think, quite unhappy with the Defense Department's ability to get a grip on its finances and on its procurement. So I spent a lot of time when I was first sent there. It sounds strange, but we took a lot of effort to get the capital plan approved. How we're going to spend the tens of millions of dollars. Right. And I think if we hadn't done it, we would have been put under some form of trusteeship by Treasury Board. And I don't think the department quite understood how unpopular they were at the time. I was lucky. I think, I came in at a time, and with the chief, we had very good relations between the two towers, and we were able to get things, a lot of things done that was perhaps on other occasions difficult to do, because if the chief and the deputy don't get along well, it's very difficult to move major files, because it puts the minister in a difficult position of having to decide between the two. And the central agencies will sort of say, well, if you guys can't get your act together, don't expect us to. I'm exaggerating to make a point, but you need to work together. And so I moved from an organization, CSIS, to answer your question directly, where I was much more concerned with operations. I wasn't the deputy director of operations, but I didn't spend an immense amount of time on finance and procurement and that sort of thing. I moved to D&D, and it was made clear to me as I was sent there, I had to do something about finance. I had to do something about procurement. I had to do something about relations between the central agencies and D&D, or things were going to deteriorate badly. And one of the things that I found difficult, and I still find difficult, is people who wear the uniform think that because they wear the uniform and they've dedicated their lives to Canada service, that everybody else will recognize that they have no faults and that they're only capable of advancing the national interest. Well, that's not true. I used to argue with the chiefs and the service chiefs that people in the military, sort of general and flag officers, should treat Ottawa as a theater of operations and learn about it in the same way they would learn if they were assigned to Afghanistan, so that we could get things better done with the civilian side, but then with government more broadly. So I spent a lot of time doing that, a lot of time trying to convince people that wearing a uniform was not sufficient. You had to have compelling business cases if you wanted to do A, B, or C. I'm, of course, generalizing. It doesn't apply to everybody. But, there was a lot of this sort of traditional think that, we absolutely need, an air defense system. We're going to get it. Well, they didn't get it. And, why didn't they get it? Because I think a business case wasn't effectively made. Now, budgets were cut centrally, which doesn't help. I've diverted myself a little bit from your basic question, but fundamentally, I think when I shifted over, I went from being in a relatively more operational department to a role that was much more corporate, and also dealing a lot more with the central agencies, trying to explain to the central agencies what D&D and CAF were up to at any particular point in time.
I'd like to explore the idea of general and flag officers being ready to operate in Ottawa, and I like the idea of Ottawa as a theater of operations. How was that received, pointing that out as the DM? Because, as you said, just not everybody's this case, but you're probably sitting there talking to a bunch of general and flag officers who have not necessarily had a good education in the town and see their own success being rank-based. Their path forward didn't have to go through Ottawa, so why does anybody else's? Again, a generalization. But how was it received having these conversations with some of the senior military leaders about actually your role and responsibility is not about that ship or that brigade, or that your role and responsibility is this town, is shaping the conditions to be able to get what the Canadian Armed Forces need?
I think the honest answer would be that it was varied. My term there was with Tom Lawson as the CDS, and he was very supportive. But he and his colleagues pointed out often, the way things were structured. General and flag officers needed to, sort of check a variety of things on their promotion schedule, and if they didn't do that, they wouldn't get promoted, and that meant that the rotation level was way faster than I thought it should be in order for them to be able to, acquire knowledge of the town. I think John Vance, when he was chief, acknowledged this by trying to lengthen the terms of service for at least the senior general and flag officers, so that they could, they know where the washroom is and how they operate, So it helped, but a lot of them didn't really like the idea. But a lot did. So my argument, I started with, if you can't convince the Treasury Board to approve a new procurement, it doesn't do any good at all for you to sort of pat yourself on the back and saying, I was in Ottawa for 2 years and I'm going to go back to Halifax or Gagetown and my successor is going to worry about. So I thought that part of the challenge was between the services. There were a whole raft of committees between the services, the three services and special ops, to try and come to an agreement on advice to the Chief of the Defence Staff on what particular activity or procurement or policy was to be given priority. It's an entirely reasonable way of proceeding. You need to talk. But one of the things I found frustrating, and I'm not the only one, was as these issues sort of work their way up to become more and more senior committees. In many, many cases, and again, I'm generalizing, there was a gentleman's agreement, forgive the sexism, gentleman's agreement that in these very senior committees, one service wouldn't criticize another. The objective of these things was to sort of say, to give you an example, the Navy today is very keen on having submarines. They want 12 submarines. I think having submarines is a highly desirable thing. I don't think they've made the case that it's essential. And the only way they could make a case that it's essential is by saying that if we're having submarines, the Air Force and the Army is not going to have something that they want. And at very senior levels, you have to do some of that internal balancing before it hits the town. And I don't think it's intuitive, I guess would be the way I would put it. I'm not saying people aren't capable of it. I'm not saying it doesn't happen sometimes. But except at the LGen level, careers are made within the individual services, I think it's fair to say. And people tend to, do their boxing, between the services. And, let me be clear, too. I didn't think that we on the civilian side were, free of fault as well. We could have done a whole variety of things to make finances and procurement more transparent and more easy to deal with for the military and for everybody else. And we tried, but we didn't do as much. But I think in the end, you take an MGen or an LGen and you assign them to a job in Ottawa and you expect them to be able to deal with an ADM environment when that ADM has spent all of his or her career maneuvering the town. And if the LGen or the Vice Admiral is lucky, he or she might have spent a little bit of time here as a colonel and not any other time. And we wonder why they aren't as effective as they could be. And my argument was, I've got not only do I have nothing against what you're trying to do, I'm telling you, if you try and think about some of the things I'm proposing, you will advance your own interest by being able to work more effectively with the civilian side and with the central agencies. And some people bought it, to be honest, they really did. Some did not. But that's true of any large organizations. You would not get unanimity on this. And no doubt part of the problem was my inadequacy in trying to explain this in a way, because like a whole raft of other departments and agencies, the immediate often took care of these broader problems. So, we set up a committee or a board or something to deal with these issues, and we'd chug along until something really urgent came up, and then we'd put it aside and we'd come back to it. I think there would be a lot to be gained if more general and flag officers could develop a bit more of an expertise on Ottawa. I don't mean to spend their entire career here. That sort of defeats the purpose of having, an effective military. But recognizing that it is part of their jobs and that they cannot expect coming in as a rear or vice admiral, never having been in Ottawa, to be able to make the central agencies swoon at their every request.
What does the National Security Advisor do?
Well, that depends, I think, more than anything on the Prime Minister of the day. The National Security Advisor's job is not based in statute. It's fully a creation of the Prime Minister. And how active he or she is depends entirely on the Prime Minister. I was made NSA for Mr. Harper. Putting words in Prime Minister's mouths is not a particularly smart thing to do, but I mean, I think what he wanted me to do was he wanted me to know what was going on in the national security, foreign and defense community in Canada. He wanted me to know what was going on in NATO and the Five Eyes and generally what was going on in this areas. He wanted me to know about the threats, and he wanted to make sure that knowing all of this, I told him about any problems before they popped up on his desk. And to the extent that I could, that I resolve these problems interdepartmentally. There's a big debate. A lot of people think that the NSA's job should be vested in statute, to be given statutory authority. I think that's very difficult to do because it would conflict with ministerial accountability. So, what do you do when the NSA, based in statute, calls over defense and tells the CDS, you're going to do X, Y, Z, that is an order, and there's a minister?
Right.
So from a machinery of government perspective, it's very, very unclear how this would work. I think an NSA is effective for as long as he or she has the Prime Minister's support. I didn't have any trouble talking to departments and agencies and occasionally suggesting paths of action to them because I think I tried really hard to advance the interests of the government and in coordinating and in getting people to do things. But fundamentally, you have to know what's going on. You have to try and deal with issues as they come up. You have to try and force, where necessary, departments and agencies to coordinate with one another. Be aware of what the allies are doing. And if you can't solve the problems, make sure that ministers and the Prime Minister are aware of it sooner rather than later. And one of the challenges, I thought, was to deal with the short, the medium, and the long term, because as we discussed earlier, the system writ large is much more attuned to the short term. Pardon me. So how do you get a prime minister or ministers or the town generally to worry about what you see as a really significant problem 5 years out? Not an easy thing to do. I think foreign interference is probably a good example of that. In the last 5 years in particular, I think it's pretty clear from what's come out under Madame Justice Hogue's inquiry, there was a serious issue here and a lot of people knew about it. But to get the town, to sort of focus on it is not an easy thing to do. So it's the short, medium, and long-term dilemma. That's a long answer to a short question.
Who was the first NSA? When was it first established?
I should know the answer to that, and I apologize I don't.
Well, I guess my question would be, as you said, it's very much dependent on the Prime Minister and what he or she is interested in. And I was wondering about maybe why it was first established, what compelled whoever it was to stand up the position.
Well, now that you mention it, I think it was under Mr. Chrétien, and it wasn't called NSA. It was called the Intelligence and Security Coordinator, which sort of morphed eventually into NSA. And I think going back then, there were two issues. We were really in a period, I referred to this earlier, where the community was very, very low energy. I don't mean on an individual level, but the community writ large. The Americans were beginning to find this frustrating. And I think the government of the day simply wanted somebody who would be able to be a focal point more than anything, because in the absence of an NSA or some similar position, you have a not inconsiderable number of departments sort of going off on their own. Who has the convening power of all of these is not necessarily clear. Or if you have a clarity, foreign affairs convenes on things foreign, but who convenes on things law enforcement? Who convenes on things, policy? So having a focal point, I think, was the main objective initially. And, somebody who could do some of the things that I talked about. But I think at the time it was actually discussed whether the person should have the title of NSA, and I think the government of the day decided no, they didn't want to go that far. They wanted an intelligence security coordinator. That was the actual title.
No comment on anybody who's filled the role, but do you think that the vision for what the NSA or the NSIA, I think as it's now called, has that been realized in the establishment of that under Prime Minister Chrétien and then
subsequently?
And subsequently. Has it sort of met its objective, or does it struggle to do so based on a number of things we've already talked about in sort of Canadian culture, whether it be political or domestic?
Well, I think there are two answers to that. There's whether or not they've met the objectives that you and I might set, and whether they've met the objectives as set by the Prime Minister of the day. I would have liked an NSA who, I'm talking over time, who had been a bit more proactive in dealing with a variety of issues. But various prime ministers didn't want this. One of the things I mentioned earlier was the general view that national security is to be dealt with, not talked about. And if you're going to do some of the things that we're inferring, you need to talk about it a bit. So, I have no doubt in my mind that if Mr. Harper had been unhappy with what I was doing or what my predecessor was doing, he would have told us. And, we would have done what we could to meet his expectations. Did he think that we were picture perfect? I suspect not. And I suspect that's true of Mr. Trudeau, who doesn't have a focus on national security. But mostly, I think because of that Canadian tournure d'esprit, this way of thinking, most prime ministers here, absent an immediate crisis, want their NSA to manage issues so that it doesn't become a significant portion of demand on their time.
What are the things right now that keep you up at night? What are the things that you are focused on as the sort of the top issues that are of concern to you, which I'm assuming you then believe should be a concern to most Canadians?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think broadly defined foreign interference, I think their possible impact on our democratic institutions is very, very important. Foreign interference in the sense that it affects diasporas in Canada. I mean, since I've retired, I've talked to a variety of people, don't mean to give the impression it's hundreds of people, but a few people who have been the object of, attempts at intimidation and whatnot. And I think they're Canadian citizens that are entitled to be protected. The third point would be, still under the broad rubric of foreign interference, IP theft, really a very significant issue in the West.
Intellectual property.
Intellectual property theft. It is a major, major issue. And it doesn't just affect government, it affects civil society and the private sector. And I guess lastly, just old-fashioned, still, if you define foreign interference broadly, old-fashioned espionage and whatnot. But I think beyond, so that's on that side. The other thing that worries me is our apparent inability to mobilize ourselves as a country to the level that many of our allies would consider as a price of our membership in, for example, NORAD or NATO. Yes, we're going to spend several $1 billion modernizing, NORAD. We're not meeting the 2% target, and I acknowledge that 2% is a bit artificial, but we're not doing those sorts of things. On a really practical level, I think somebody somewhere has got to do something about the state of the military. I think They have been under-resourced. They've suffered from mission creep. But I also think that internally that more could be done. I mean, the recruitment and retention program in the Canadian Forces is not a matter for ministers. It is a matter for people who wear uniforms. Spending billions of dollars on national defense seems to me is a bit of a logical consequence. Again, I'm generalizing to make a point. But, the last time I checked, we were something like 22,000 personnel short in the regular and reserve force. Ministers aren't going to solve this problem. This has to be done by the military and the public service. And for the last little while, I am well aware people have tried any number of things. It ain't working. So one of the things that I think we need to acknowledge on that front is that, it's easy for everybody to blame ministers for everything. Well, sometimes we public servants, we military, bear some of the responsibility as well. So I think on the military side, we've got to do something about that because, we can, as I say, we can spend billions of dollars on this, that, or the other thing, but we need people to man the ships, the planes, the tanks, and whatnot. So it's that foreign interference writ large. Always worried, and I've been, I speak a little bit about some of these things in public. I think we've underestimated, as the head of MI5 or 6 said yesterday, the risk of terrorism over the course of the next little while. And broadly speaking, there's China. We need to come to grips with China. And I think our current government has been very slow to acknowledge that China is a strategic adversary. Doesn't mean we're at war. China's there. We have to find a way of dealing with China on those issues where it's possible to do that. But we're still behind, I think, the 8 ball as compared to a number of our allies. And I guess I'm going on at too great a length. You should kick me under the table. But, what's going on in the Middle East is really worrisome. Absent, just forgetting a minute who's responsible for what right now, for the next X number of generations, every Israeli is going to hate anybody who has anything to do with Palestine, and every Palestinian is going to hate every Israeli. The possibility of moving towards a two-state solution or any solution, I think, is going down the tube. I think the possibility of rapprochement between Israel and a number of Arab states are much less than it was before. And then the possibility that you know as well or better than I do of an explosion there is always possible. And then Ukraine. First time since World War II that a country has militarily invaded another. We're holding together. The West is fairly effectively. But a lot of this depends on United States leadership. We don't know what's going to happen after the U.S. presidential elections in less than a month now, I guess it is. So that was a fairly long list of things that I worry about. And, I don't mean to suggest that any more than anybody else, am I bouncing off walls? But I think there's a lot to worry about in the world today. And I wish the governments of Canada would spend more time worrying about national security, foreign affairs, and defense, as opposed to dealing with the issues of the day.
Let's take the foreign interference piece, and I picked that out of the list because I think that most Canadians, although probably feel that what's going on in the Middle East won't necessarily impact them. Russia and Ukraine won't necessarily impact them. But on the foreign interference, but those conflicts, they can at least cognitively understand that war is bad and war is going to have a number of impacts. The foreign interference one might be a little bit more esoteric for people, and it's really in the news these days. And one of the things I try to do with this podcast is to be able to try to communicate to Canadians like why this should matter to them. So why maybe when they're on the OC Transpo in the morning commuting to work or picking their kids up at hockey practice, they shouldn't maybe switch off CBC, or they shouldn't, flip that podcast because it's talking about foreign interference. And why should I care as a Canadian? It doesn't really impact me, or I don't know how it impacts me. So how does something like foreign interference that has been in the news so much as of late be something that Canadians should care about, because it actually does, maybe not tomorrow, but it actually does impact their children's futures?
That is the $54,000 question. I think you have to start from the premise that, particularly under President Xi, China has become much, much more assertive in trying to improve its position of leadership control in the world, and that they have effectively no limits on what they're prepared to do to advance their interest, to a considerable degree oriented towards the United States, but against the West generally. So their approach to this has been to sow chaos to the extent they can between countries and within countries. They have an almost unlimited budget and number of people in order to advance their interests in this fashion. So I think one of the most precious gifts that Canadians have is our democracy. If you have a foreign state trying to influence who is going to be elected to the House of Commons or a legislature, that is something to worry about, I think. And there's clear evidence that in some cases this happens. The challenge, of course, is that it's not very visible. It doesn't mean that if they don't like a particular candidate for the House of Commons, they're going to kidnap the person or do something like that. But by spending money on the other candidate, by spreading mis and disinformation about somebody who's either a candidate or a candidate within a political party, or by threatening people, to cause them to develop positions in the ethnic media, or by spending a lot of money in the ethnic press positively for a particular candidate. But my point is, democracy in this country is, I think, one of our most cherished attributes. And if any country, and it ain't just China, we need to remind ourselves, I think it's been made clear before Justice Hogg's inquiry recently, at least 4 or 5 countries are trying to influence how we run this country. And I don't think that's a good thing. And as I mentioned earlier, intimidation attempts on the part of some of these countries against some of our citizens, surely to God, you don't have to see your next door neighbor being, hauled away in the trunk of a car to realize how dangerous, how terrible it is. If you're from country X, where the secret police, is the most important component of your government, and you're told that if you don't do X, Y, Z, or if you don't not do X, Y, Z, your parents back in the host country are going to be subject to intimidation. That is very, very frightening. And yes, it might not affect you directly or me directly, but it affects our fellow citizens, and I think we need to do something about it. But it's also, I've talked about foreign interference relating to our democratic institutions, but it's not just elections, it's democratic institutions generally. It's not just the federal level. It's people trying to muck about with some of our industries, traditional espionage, which again is a form of foreign interference. But I think you have to start from the premise that we're not living in, I can't think of a better way, we're not living in paradise. There are countries who fundamentally do not like the way the world is organized. We have contributed to its current form of organization, and they want to change it, and they're going to use whatever means they can, short of war, to make those changes. And in fact, eventually it will have an impact. And your point, I think, is a correct one. Part of the issue is it's not tomorrow. It's not something that's really obvious on a day-to-day basis. It's looking at China broadly and Russia broadly and these other countries broadly and realizing they're not out there to be our friends. They are not our friends. I think we're moving a bit towards the sphere of influence kind of environment that we were in years ago. But just to illustrate China again, and I'm going beyond your question, I was recently in Taiwan with a bunch of people that I know. We were there at the invitation of the government of Taiwan because we've been trying to, talk to them about how the government of Canada should treat Taiwan. 40% plus of the world's container traffic goes through the Straits of Taiwan. It goes through the Straits of Taiwan right now because it is considered to be an international waterway. China considers it to be its internal waters. If we in the West, and if Taiwan does not succeed in heading off China's desire to control that waterway, that 40% plus of container traffic is going to be subject to Chinese control. I don't think that's in the interest of the private sector, civil society, of any of our governments. So that's a more immediate thing, but I probably think there are no more than 1,000 people in Canada who realize that 40% plus of container traffic in the world goes through the Taiwan Straits. I believe that governments have a leadership explanation role in some of these areas, and I don't think that successive governments have been very inclined to do that. So I think we need more of that from our governments. I don't mean fear-mongering, because I don't think the world's going to be blown up tomorrow. But if Canadians don't hear from their government about some of these threats, the real worry is mis and disinformation, which is rampant. You don't have to go into the dark web, to find really outrageous suggestions about how the West is organized, how our government is organized, what our allies are doing. So you put all this together in a stew, and it comes out to be pretty toxic. Canadians don't like talking about it. It's not a short-term issue. So that's the best I can do.
Maybe I'll use that, your point about Canadians don't like to talk about it as the last question to wrap up our discussion. And I have asked some previous podcast guests, if you were to provide advice to, any of the political parties in the election we're going to have in a year from now, but who knows, this election could be far sooner than that. Regardless of what's going on in Parliament these days, in the run-up to the next election, any advice that you could give to Canadians on what they should be expecting to hear from the parties on some of these issues? Or I guess the same way, if you were giving advice to the political parties in the run-up to the election, the sort of policy changes or language they should be using that you think would indicate a positive shift towards a place that we should be?
Well, on the latter point, some of the things I've said may lead you to believe that I don't have a great deal of respect for people who are in political life. That's not true. Don't agree with everything, but that's a different issue. But my fundamental view on that side is that politicians are actually not stupid at all. There are no votes in foreign defense and security policy. So until the Canadian public or some inspirational member of a political party chooses to raise the profile of these issues, I think the chances of getting political parties to focus on foreign defense or security policy are not great. The one thing that could shift is a major crisis, of course, a significant security strategic level crisis, either in Europe or the Middle East, or something happens after the federal presidential election in the United States. But after those possibilities, I think, most political operatives and potential ministers and MPs recognize there are no votes in the things that we're talking about. So I don't know what advice I would give them, except they should at least try, to talk about these things, put a little bit more in their party platforms to recognize that in our interconnected world, a lot of these things are going to affect us and that they may be called upon to deal with some of these issues. On the other side of the equation, again, I don't have any brilliant prescription, except I think Canadians should start asking questions when they go to nominate. If they're a member of a political party and they go to a nomination meeting to select their candidate for Parliament, they should start asking questions about, what's your view of defense, security, or national security? During the election, I think we should start asking, between the parties, questions about these sorts of things. I think the media should maybe try a little bit harder to push some of these questions. But as I mentioned earlier, the last two elections, these issues were barely mentioned. I think the world is in worse shape today than it was during the last two elections, so I think it's even more important to start talking about these things. How realistic are, the current government has made a commitment to purchase, I think it is 12 submarines. I think they should be seriously questioned about the realism of such a commitment, both in terms of our being able to procure the submarines before, the year 2222. and whether the amount of resources required are going to be made available, the impact it would have on other parts of the military, but not just the military, on other parts of the national security community. We just have to start asking questions more than we have, start pushing the view that these issues are important. It's a very imperfect answer to your question, but I don't know what else we can do, absent a major crisis, where it does galvanize people.
This has been a real pleasure, Dick, to have a chance to spend some time with you, to pick your brain on your years of service and insight into a whole bunch of different aspects of our national security architecture. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you for being one of our Northern Sentinels.
Thank you. It was a pleasure talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Dick Fadden. Please subscribe to The Greater Good on Substack to get this and other content to help you citizen better. Thanks for listening, and goodbye until next time.